Time now for Inside Utah Politics.
Hey, thanks for joining us, everyone. I'm Brian McElhatton. Let's go inside Utah politics now. Randy Shumway, chair of the Homeless Service Board, joins us now, and I'm so glad you're here. This is a new board. This is a new body tackling the homeless problem. We hear a lot about that in the news, so let's talk about that. Broad strokes here. The legislature kind of carved out a space for this board to form in the recent legislative session, and now you're tasked with putting together a group of people to tackle this problem, right? What's that like?
What I like about the state's approach is they are saying this is not a municipal problem. This crosses municipal lines, and we need to bring all the services and energy from the state to bear to help.
So there have been many groups, there are many groups who are tackling various aspects of our homeless problem. Something that sets this board apart, I understand, is the use of data to get some raw information on what exactly is going on, right? Tell me about that.
Well, the most important aspect of data is going to originate from the know-by-name system. And the know-by-name system is exactly what it sounds like. It is, we will know every individual and their unique needs. We will have an individualized care plan for each individual. They'll have a clinical behavioral health specialist that's helping them along that continuum of improvement. And we'll be able to track what's working, what's not working, where people are going next along that continuum of improvement, and the degree to which our services are having success.
So these are people coming into shelters, leaving shelters, and seeking help, right?
These are individuals who are receiving services from states and municipalities.
Yeah. When you look at this issue, it is so big, right? How do you even begin, other than the data, how do you begin to tackle this? Where do you start?
I'll sound a little academic at first, but across the country, we've made two fatal flaws. And we probably need to start there. Number one is we have characterized people experiencing homelessness as all very similar. And the reality is that our chronically homeless have very different circumstances than our situationally homeless. Okay. For our situationally homeless, the evidence-based practices around housing, jobs, education, health care are very compelling on the degree to which they help individuals reboot. But those same services oftentimes exacerbate the root challenges for our chronically homeless. And that's why you've seen such drastic growth in our chronically homeless population over the last number of years across the country. Today in the state of Utah, approximately 27% of those experiencing homelessness are characterized as chronically homeless.
27%.
And for them, the root difficulty is not jobs or housing or economic, it's trauma. With two companions, debilitating mental and behavioral health disabilities and substance use disorders. And therefore, the solutions that might work to help an individual that's experiencing situational homelessness might actually make things worse for an individual experiencing chronic homelessness. The second issue is because we misdiagnosed the problem, we also misdiagnosed what success looks like. We said, well, the root problem is housing, and therefore the solution is housing. But bringing someone in from the cold who is navigating debilitating mental health disability and substance use disorder and simply providing a roof over their head isn't getting to the root problem.
You can't just put them in a tiny home or a shelter of some kind, right? You've got to have services for them.
So understanding that human dignity is the ultimate objective, and that we're in the business of improving lives really changes how the state is going to bring services to bear and accountability to bear to help people along that continuum of improvement.
Because there is, of course, the taxpayer money aspect of this, and how do we know that's going to the most effective methods to deal with the problem? How is that being accounted for? That's part of the equation, too.
Absolutely. Yeah. But we talk about accountability. It's not just in knowing what works and what doesn't work, but it's also in a lot of individuals that are experiencing debilitating mental health disability, substance use disorder. They have tried over and over and over again and failed. And they've lost hope. They've lost confidence in themselves. And when we as service providers look them in the eye and say, we don't believe in you either, that's problematic. when we as service providers look them in the eye and say, I know you've lost hope, I haven't. Lean on me. I know that you can succeed. I believe in you. And having those expectations in human potential helps people improve along that continuum of care.
So accountability, not just in terms of the work that's being done, how it's getting paid for, but also the outcomes here.
Absolutely.
Right? And the support you say these folks need to feel.
Absolutely.
That's a big part of this. Yeah. We talked about chronic homelessness, situational homelessness. See, I've never heard it broken down into these terms before. So situational homelessness, tell us about that.
Situational homelessness is episodic. It often is induced from job loss, getting up over one's skis and economically, debt, an unexpected health crisis, things like that. And in those situations, the evidence, believe it or not, you could hand somebody $1,000 and the evidence is pretty compelling that that alone can be the catalyst for helping them get back on their feet. Hand an individual who's experiencing chronic homelessness, who has debilitating mental health disabilities, substance use disorder, $1,000, and you might have just dug their crisis a little deeper.
Sure. That makes sense. That makes sense. Something I think is interesting about the Services Board is the fact that this is not just a government solution here, but you're teaming up with the private sector, with nonprofits, and so it's a group effort. Tell me about that.
You have seen significant engagement from the philanthropic, business, and faith-based segments of Utah. Everybody bringing resources, energy to bear in order to help our most vulnerable populations. It really does give you hope in humanity. You're seeing Utah at its very best. It crosses political lines. Serving as chair of the Homeless Board, I'm assigned to ask 4 individuals to serve on the executive committee. I called Erin Mendenhall, our mayor of Salt Lake City, and said, Mayor, will you serve on the executive committee? She's already on the board, but will you serve on the executive committee of the board? And she said, you know, Randy, you and I don't always see eye to eye on these things. And I said, exactly, Mayor. That's why we desperately need your voice, your perspective, your experience on this executive committee so that we can, our objectives are the exact same. Our objectives are the exact same. And our desire of how to go about getting there is probably identical as well. And our, the ability of people from across political aisles to just collaborate and respect one another and finding what are the right solutions is really inspiring in my mind.
Because this issue, we often talk about it in a political context. There's a bill here or an ordinance here, but this is not an inherently political issue, is it?
This transcends politics. And that's why I say, you know, even if I might disagree with an individual on the approach, we are completely aligned on what the ultimate objective is and the need for us to bring our maximum intellect and resources to bear in order to help this vulnerable population.
Can people at home get involved here? How can they help?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, Pamela Atkinson, the Mother Teresa of Utah, a number of years ago said the single best thing individuals can do is stop giving money to panhandlers and instead donate to these good service providers, these organizations that are providing services. See, when you give money to a panhandler, your intent is to do good, but the data is pretty compelling that for the most part it's going towards illegal activities. Contrast that with providing donations to service providers. I think it's humandignity.org. I should know because it's part of the Utah Impact Partnership that I'm a member of. But donating there allows us to bring services to individuals that will address the root problems, but it also helps us know who they are so that those individualized care plans are personalized for their unique needs and focused on helping them improve towards increased human dignity.
Okay, using data and marshaling resources across sectors to help our unhoused neighbors. Randy Shumway, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
I appreciate it so much.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
All right, coming up next on Inside Utah Politics, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken promising continued support for Ukraine now. Find out the latest plans to help the war-torn country as Russia escalates its attacks. U.S. military aid is making its way now to Ukraine as Russia escalates attacks in the east. This week, Secretary of State Antony Blinken assured leaders while in Ukraine that help is indeed on the way. Our Washington correspondent, Maddie Biertemple, has this report.
You are not alone.
That was the message U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken shared with Ukraine, now more than 2 years into its war against Russia.
The United States has been by your side from day one. We are with you today.
While visiting Kyiv, Blinken told leaders U.S. military aid is on the way as Russia pushes further into the east.
Some of it's already arrived. More of it will be arriving.
Congress approved $61 billion last month for the war-torn country after months of delaying a vote.
And that's going to make a real difference against the ongoing Russian aggression on the battlefield.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky thanked the U.S. for the support.
Big appreciation from Ukrainians to Americans for this.
Blinken also voiced support for bringing Ukraine into NATO. He says the U.S. will take tangible steps at a summit this summer.
We'll make sure that Ukraine's bridge to NATO is strong and well lit.
But in the meantime, Zelensky said more help is needed, especially air defense systems in the northeast region of Kharkiv, the second largest city where Russia is ramping up attacks.
Civilians and warriors, everybody there under Russian missiles.
Blinken said the U.S. is trying to address that.
We're working relentlessly with allies and partners to procure more air defense.
Following his remarks, Blinken joined Ukrainian musicians on stage.
The biggest friends of Ukraine, Antony Blinken,
for a rendition of Rockin' in the Free World. In Washington, I'm Maddie Biertemple.
Also top officials in Washington are marking the 70th anniversary of the landmark Brown v. Board of Education decision that outlawed segregation of public schools all across the country. Washington correspondent Jesse Tenur reports on how far officials say schools have come since that historic case.
I was just a 6-year-old girl going to school.
Gail Etienne can still feel the hate she endured on her first day at an all-white school in Louisiana.
It looked like if they could get to me, they would kill me, and I didn't know why.
Etienne and Leona Tate are members of the New Orleans Four. 70 years ago, the Brown versus Board of Education decision paved the way for black students to integrate schools.
We must have sat there half the day before they even decided to place us in the classroom.
But at a Justice Department ceremony Tuesday celebrating the decision's 70th anniversary, officials say segregation still exists.
There's still so much work that we need to do to protect our kids.
Kristen Clark, the Assistant Attorney General of the Civil Rights Division, says examples of segregation include unequal access to higher-level courses and disciplinary actions against students.
We need a level playing field that gives every kid a fair chance.
The Government Accountability Office reports more than 18 million students still attend a segregated school today. To fight back, Clark says the Justice Department sues schools to reach settlements.
We can't take progress for granted.
Education Secretary Miguel Cardona says his department is also fighting back against curriculum changes and book bans in some states.
We all know that Black history is American history.
These officials argue equal access to education ultimately means equal access to other opportunities, like jobs and housing. In Washington, I'm Jesse Tenor.
Still to come here, the race for Utah's governor. Democratic candidate Brian King is joining us to talk about the changes he'd like to see if he becomes Utah's next governor. Welcome back, everyone, to Inside Utah Politics. We have Brian King as our guest, Democratic candidate for governor, joining us on the show now. Glad you're here, Mr. King.
Thank you.
Okay, so how's the campaign going so far? You're focused on the general election now, right?
Right.
What's going on?
I don't have a primary, so I am focused on the November election. We're getting around the state. We're visiting to people. We're listening, talking to folks about what's on their mind. It's interesting to see what people are concerned about and to hear them. And of course, it's very different when you're talking about Salt Lake County versus some of our locations in rural Utah. But the thing that I've really enjoyed is getting to know people, getting to meet them and hear about their particular problems and issues and things they're concerned about.
What are you hearing over and over again as you talk to those people?
Well, particularly along the Wasatch Front, I think housing affordability is a huge issue. And that's something that is complex, it's difficult, but it's something that I feel. I've got a daughter and son-in-law who are working to move up in the market, and another daughter who is working to try to get into her first home. And so, you know, it's a challenge for them. And I think that we have seen housing prices just go through the roof. And a lot of that is sort of the flip side of Utah as a growth state. We've really done well in this state in terms of our economic growth, and that's great. But we have to deal with the downside, and the downside is rising housing prices. There are a lot of ways we can do that.
So what do you think the state is doing right when it comes to that? I know Governor Cox likes to talk about the 35,000 starter homes, that initiative. What do you think the state could be doing better?
I think that we could do a number of things better. I think that we could hold some of our developers. We can put in place incentives for our real estate developers to build affordable homes, starter homes, but we need to put in place accountability for them too. I don't want to just give away free money to developers and do it in a way that causes them to not be accountable in terms of making sure that they put in place the stock that we're incentivizing them to build in terms of affordable homes. We can do a much better job than we are in terms of putting together transit-oriented developments that are focused around transportation issues and hubs that allow for cities and towns on a local level to come up with plans that make sense for them, and that put in place city and town centers that are easy for people to get to and easy for people to work out of. We can do a much better job than we are, I think, in making housing affordable in rural Utah. It's a struggle in rural Utah as well as along the Wasatch Front, and we can do that through, again, transportation initiatives, proper planning and zoning, deferring to counties and towns and cities in a way that way too often at the state level we have a tendency to take power away from counties and cities and towns. We need to empower them for putting in place what makes sense for them to really put in place affordable homes in those counties and towns and cities.
So I'm really curious, you mentioned the difference between the urban environments, the suburban environments, and then the rural areas. Talk about housing in those two different types of spaces and the unique concerns that we have there. What are some of the differences?
Well, one of the issues along the Wasatch Front is transportation. Yeah. This is this transportation-oriented development where you want to make sure that wherever people live, they have the ability to access a way to getting to where they work. And we can do that by expanding light rail. We can do that by expanding front runner. We can do that by expanding our bus service. We can do that by putting in place town centers and empowering, again, cities and towns, the local areas to build town squares and town centers that have what people need to just do their work and their shopping and living from day to day in a more concentrated area there, as opposed to having to travel around. Once you do that, you're able to improve the likelihood that people can afford to live in certain areas because they don't have to spend money traveling. We also can deal with urban and density issues. Those are, again, something that I want to leave to neighborhoods to figure out. When you're talking about rural Utah, you're talking more about broad-based economic development issues. You're talking about making sure that you have a vibrant economy at rural levels. We've made some progress on that in Utah, in large part due to the Biden administration doing things like expanding broadband infrastructure in rural Utah. Nothing's going to empower and improve economic development in rural Utah like making sure that we have extensive broadband that is throughout rural Utah in a way that allows people right now, they may not consider moving to rural Utah because it's too difficult to work in terms of having a good, stable internet connection. But if you have a good, stable internet connection with broadband, you're going to make it much more likely that people say, okay, I'll work from home in a location 100 miles from the urban center I would never have considered doing just a year or two ago.
Yeah, there's been a federal push, as you mentioned, to expand rural broadband in many parts of the country. But, you know, those companies will say this is an expensive endeavor. We're going to run fiber or wireless connections out to people who live in relatively small communities, right? It's a big investment, not as much of a return as if we were building something out in the greater Salt Lake area. So from the state level, how do you incentivize those companies to come in and get that work done?
There are ways that you can do it, I think, with putting in place a tax structure that incentivizes them. And you sometimes will target certain areas that really need development that are hardest hit by a lack of infrastructure to say, we're going to put in place something that works for you and you alone out in whatever it is, Rich County or Iron County or Millard County, places that may have special needs in terms of providing incentives for companies to come in. The critical thing is if we can get good communication infrastructure like that to rural Utah, it's never been easier to work in locations that are removed from where you had to work 50 years ago, or even 10 or 15 years ago, in terms of going into a workplace where your counterparts, where your colleagues were. We're moving away from that. We're moving to a point where you can work away from the office and at home, and we can't do that without good broadband connections. So we need to continue to build that infrastructure.
Now, you've spent a lot of time in the House of Representatives, former House Minority Leader, so you've got that experience there in the House. How do you think that translates to the office of the governor?
Oh, I think it's critical. Right now, we have a supermajority control of the legislature by one party. And we also have a governor who is of that same party. One of the problems that we've got when you have one-party control of both the legislature and the executive branch is that the legislature does and has, in this situation with our current governor, said we're the ones who are going to call the tune, and you have to dance to what tune we call, Governor. And that can be okay if you have wise voices at the legislature, but when you have a supermajority control of the legislature, you have the most extreme voices who are empowered. When you have extreme voices empowered, what you really need in a state is a governor who will stand up to those extreme voices and say, you've gone too far. And one of my grievances that I have about Governor Cox is that he has signed into law every divisive and extreme measure that the legislature passes. He just doesn't stand up to the legislature's most extreme and divisive and unnecessary legislation. We can do better in Utah. Utah deserves better. I like the governor's approach when he says we need to disagree better. Mm-hmm. That's very commendable and important. I agree with him. But he doesn't take the next step, which is as important or even more important, which is to disagree for the better, to recognize it's by competing ideas coming into conflict with each other and having the best of those competing ideas fall out. That's where you really get the best benefit for Utahns. And that is not what we've been having, because the governor does not stand up to the legislature, especially on these extreme issues and bills that we've passed, in a way that if I were governor, I would.
Let me ask you, to that point, if you were to be governor, you'd be working with Republicans in both chambers here who have a very strong push, a very strong voice. They could just, override a veto or something like that. How do you anticipate getting some of your proposals across if you feel like you're going up against, opposition in such strong terms in both houses?
Yeah, I love that question. Thank you. I've served for 16 years in the legislature. I've passed many bills, and I've never passed a bill without having most of the people voting for it as Republicans. That's just the nature of living in a supermajority legislature when you're in the minority party. So I can get along with the other side and get along well to pass good legislation. One of the things that you've got to do is stand up and build personal relationships with people so that you try to get beyond the labels and get beyond the team red, team blue stuff. There's a lot of dynamic. We see it in Congress in Washington, D.C. about, I'm a Democrat, I'm a Republican, I'm on this team and that team, and therefore we don't find common ground, or we yell at each other all the time. We don't do that nearly as much in the Utah.
You all get along behind the scenes?
Well, we do more so than they do in Congress, that's true. There are some things that we fight about, but I think that having the relationships that you need to get along well with the other side at a personal level is important. We'll disagree politically at points, and when we do disagree politically, I think the difference between myself and Governor Cox will be, I will veto that bill, and then I will say to the legislature, I hope you don't override my veto, but regardless of whether you do or you don't, one thing I'm going to do that is different than what Governor Cox has done is I'm going to take to the people of the state of Utah my position and inform them why I vetoed the bill. And if I exercise my judgment wisely, which I intend to do, I'm going to find that the people of the state of Utah support the governor and not the legislature on critically important issues. So, that's not something that Governor Cox has done. And I think that Utahns have, it's been to their detriment that he hasn't done that.
Brian King, we appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Good
Brian.
Conversation, absolutely. Okay, stay with us, everybody. More Inside Utah Politics is coming up next. And that does it for this edition of Inside Utah Politics. Don't forget, if you have any local political stories you'd like to see, someone we should talk to, make sure to reach out. Thanks so much for being with us, everybody. We'll see you right back here next week.